This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. The Nigel Farage Show.
Rarely play music on this show, but you're listening there to the RAF March, those very familiar tones. And it's worth reflecting, isn't it, that 100 years ago today the Royal Air Force was formed. It was a merger, effectively, of the Army's Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Navy's Royal Naval Air Service. And today, many events going on. There's Stowe Mary's in Essex, which is an airfield exactly as it was back in 1918 at Biggin Hill, of course, the most famous fighter station of them all, and very near where I grew up. Many events going on there. And at the Church of St Clement Danes at the end of the Strand here in London, senior figures and veterans from the RAF are attending a Founders' Day service, and the Queen has sent a message of congratulations. And if ever you're in London, in the Strand area, you've got some free time, go into the church and you'll see the Roll of Honour and all the people in both wars that were killed serving in the Royal Air Force. It is, in its own way, pretty humbling. I was very keen for us to talk about this subject today because whilst I think all of us know a fair bit about the Battle of Britain, about the still continuing controversy that exists over Bomber Command and the bombing of German cities through late 44 into 45, hardly any of us really know much about what the Royal Air Force did from the 1st of April 1918 through to the 11th of November 1918. So I thought, well, I need to get a proper expert on, and well, I didn't do badly because I managed to get Seb Cox in, and he is head of the Air Historical Branch of the Royal Air Force. He came in at 9:15 this morning to do a pre-record because, of course, he's there at the Church of St Clement Danes as we speak. And I began by asking him about the birth of the Royal Air Force and why it was so tricky.
Well, yes, you could put it like that. Yeah, there were a variety of factors which led to the birth of the Royal Air Force. The principal one initially was the Germans bombed London in the summer of 1917. They bombed it in daylight. They flew a formation of aircraft over London during the day in that summer, dropped bombs on London. And the two air services which were existent at the time, there was the Royal Flying Corps, part of the Army, the Royal Naval Air Service, part of the Navy. They sent up aircraft to try and intercept the Germans, but in fact, we lost more aircraft than the Germans did.
Oh, wow.
So, bombing London in daylight and without any very obvious defensive reaction caused a bit of a row. The media reacted very sharply. There was a lot of press comment, and the Prime Minister came under a certain amount of fire in the House of Commons. So Lloyd George, the Prime Minister at the time, he appointed, interestingly enough, a South African general, Smuts. A South African, I think, because he was seen as being slightly more neutral than a British general would have been. And Smuts was appointed to investigate the whole of the organisation of British air defences and British air services in general. And it was Smuts, largely influenced by a leading airman, General Henderson, it was Smuts who recommended that the two separate Navy and Army air services should be merged into one. And that essentially was the result. We get the Royal Air Force.
But I read that the Army resented it, the Navy resented it.
They both, parts of them opposed it at the time, but Lloyd George, in part I think because he was a little bit aggravated by the leading servicemen. He had a combative relationship with some of the senior generals.
He said he did, yeah.
So I think it was also part of his plan to try and circumvent the generals. And so essentially, although the admirals and the generals, or some of them, were opposed to it, the politicians pushed it through anyway.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we sort of know quite a lot about World War II. What interests me is how little people seem to know about, and you mentioned the bombing raid by aeroplane, and of course prior to that the Zeppelins. But give us some idea of the scale of the RAF on the Western Front by the end of the First World War.
Well, the RAF as a whole, at the end of the war, there are 22,000 aircraft.
That's a mind-blowing number.
Yeah, and about more than 200,000 personnel, men and women. So it was an enormous enterprise. Now, that 22,000 included a lot of aircraft in reserve because these are canvas and wooden biplanes. They're not very reliable. They are relatively easy to shoot down in terms of they catch fire quite easily. Yeah. Unfortunately, so it's perfectly possible that a squadron would turn over its entire complement of aircraft in a month. Yeah,
and I've read that life expectancy for a pilot
it varied. Yeah, it varied, but at times it wasn't very good. They had no parachutes, of course. These poor chaps up at 10,000 feet. If their aircraft catches fire, that's that.
Yeah. And of course, with the end of the war to end all wars, there was no need for a Royal Air Force, really, was there?
Well, that's what the Navy and the Army, you'll be surprised to learn, that's exactly what they said. They said, well, some sort of wartime, we don't need an Air Force in anymore. We only formed it during this rather major war. And as the defence budget, funny old thing, Treasury is demanding
cuts. Doesn't change, does it?
Well, I couldn't possibly comment on that, Nigel, but the Treasury certainly, and indeed Lloyd George, were certainly intent on reducing the defence budget, not unreasonably saying, well, we've got to pay for this massive war we've just gone through. So the Army and the Navy said, well, you can save money if you abolish the Air Force. But Hugh Trenchard, who was the Chief of the Air Force at the time, and a very shrewd character, Trenchard actually said, we can save you money to the government. We can do things much more cheaply than the Army or the Navy, particularly the Army, and actually we're a relatively inexpensive force.
Yeah, and would it be fair to say that during the interwar period, that one of the great champions of the RAF and air defences and air power was Winston Churchill?
He certainly was. He was appointed as Secretary of State for War and Air immediately after the war by Lloyd George. And he, in conjunction with Trenchard convinced him that the Air Force was a good thing. And in that initial period, when Trenchard was, as it were, the senior politician in charge, he did help to preserve the Air Force. And he's generally a supporter of the Air Force. Later on, of course, he becomes Chancellor of the Exchequer. And funny old thing, like all chancellors, he doesn't want to spend much money. Yeah. But he was never one of those who believed that you should abolish the Air Force.
And he makes a very strong argument, from 1933 onwards, that Germany is building up the Luftwaffe and that we need to do something. And by the time 1940 comes and France has fallen, the retreat from Dunkirk has happened, and the Battle of Britain is upon us, we're quite seriously outnumbered, aren't we?
We are. There's a bit of exaggeration about the numbers. The Luftwaffe is a bigger air force, but generally speaking, there's a rough equivalence between the two fighter forces. But the Germans, of course, can choose where they're going to attack, and by the time of the Battle of Britain, they have airfields stretching from Brittany right round to Norway. So Britain is partially surrounded, if you like. And Fighter Command has to defend the entire country. The Germans, of course, basically mostly concentrate on the southern part of the country. They only attack in the north once during the Battle of Britain. But Hugh Dowding, the commander of Fighter Command, he has to cover the whole country. So in the air, the fighter pilots did often meet superior numbers. The great advantage that we had, of course, was that Britain had a proper radar-directed air defence system, the first in the world. Remarkably, the very first experiment in radar had only taken place in 1935. The RAF had flown an aeroplane up and down near the BBC. I'm sorry to mention your rivals, but the BBC transmitter.
Well, they were there first.
The indeed, the BBC transmitter near Daventry, and Watson Watt, the famous inventor of radar, had his equipment in a field. He and Mr. Wilkins, who everybody forgets, sat in a field literally with their equipment in the back of a van and proved the concept of bouncing a radio wave off an airplane.
And it's interesting to note, isn't it, that with the Battle of Britain, I think maybe we don't discuss this enough, that it wasn't just British people in the air fighting in Spitfires and Hurricanes.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. There were significant numbers of Poles, there were Canadians, Australians, there were even a few Americans and a few Frenchmen, but a whole polyglot conglomeration of nations.
And I even saw a cafe in Prague last year in the Czech Republic called the Spitfire Cafe, commemorating the fact that they'd had a contribution too.
Indeed.
I mean, it was called The Finest Hour and Never in the Field of Human History and all of those things, and it's seen as a glorious moment. But thereafter, you know, under Bomber Harris, as he was known, Sir Arthur Harris, we launched this, well, along with the Americans too, of course, massive bombing campaign on German cities. And I know finally a memorial's gone up to Bomber Command here in central London. Is there a feeling on this centenary day, when there is much to remember and quite a bit to celebrate, is there still a feeling that perhaps some of those decisions taken about cities to be bombed in late 44 and through 45 does slightly mar the RAF's history?
Well, that's certainly a view that some people take. My own opinion is that you have an extremely powerful bomber force which you've built up at great cost during the war. The Germans are still fighting hard, and so you're not simply going to let that bomber force sit on the ground. And it's as well to remember that people talk about it's only bombing cities. They're not only bombing cities. The RAF and the 8th Air Force, between them, and indeed there's another air force down in Italy, they reduced the Germans' capacity to manufacture oil, much of it done using synthetic technologies, by about 90% by early 1945. Harris is often criticised, but he did what he was asked to do. And by the time you're into early 1945, German oil refining capacity is down to about 10% of its theoretical maximum, and you have the much vaunted panzer divisions unable to manoeuvre. They can manoeuvre tactically, but
That's a very important point.
They can't do it.
That's
what
a very
you might call
important
strategically.
point. Yeah.
And the Germans have not given up. You know, there are significant casualties to the Allied armies fighting in Western Europe, who included my father. The Germans don't give up until the end of the war.
Yeah.
They are inflicting serious casualties on the Allies. You are not going to keep these bombers on the ground until you've won the war.
Yeah. Yeah, and if we go ahead from there, I mean, we obviously remember the Vulcan bombers bombing Port Stanley, but actually in the last 20 years, the Royal Air Force has been very busy, hasn't it? It
has. It's been busy practically every day. The Air Force has been engaged since really Gulf War I in the early 90s. The Air Force has been active practically every day since that time, and it still is, of course, in the Middle East. We're still operating. The Air Force was in Iraq, the Air Force was in Afghanistan, and it's still there, still operating against the enemies of the Queen and protecting the nation.
Well, I have to say on this centenary, what do people who are listening to this who are fascinated, where do they go to find out more about the RAF? Or if they want to help, where would they give money?
Well, the major RAF charities have formed a sort of central RAF 100 charity, so that they're not all fighting, as it were, for your money.
Yep.
So they will divide it between them. So it includes, for example, the RAF Benevolent Fund, the RAF Association, the RAF Museum. These 5 major charities have all combined so that they're not splitting your money. You can only devote your money to the RAF 100 charity rather than saying, "Oh, which one shall I go for?"
Yep.
So there's an RAF 100 website. If you Google it,
Yep.
you will find it. And if they want to learn more, then I recommend that they go to the RAF Museum at Hendon, which has got a major new exhibition to be opened shortly, devoted to the 100 years of the Royal Air Force, and it's going to be absolutely spectacular.
Well, Seb Cox, head of the Air Historical Branch of the RAF, can I wish you a very happy 100th birthday?
Thank you very much, Nigel.
Well, I don't know about you, I learned an awful lot there from Seb Cox. In a moment, your thoughts, your reflections on what the RAF means to you on its 100th birthday. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's 11:18. Well, that's the RAF March, and I played a little bit of it there because it's the 100th birthday of the Royal Air Force. And, of course, this is LBC. Unlike all the other Sunday programmes, which have just become really journalists talking to journalists, this is your chance. And I want to know from you, what has the RAF meant to you and to your family? And Caroline from Fulham says, all those lovely tunes that evoke so much to so many. Today, 100 years of the RAF, Dam Busters, etc. Were taught to generations of music students at Kneller Hall, now being eyed for housing. So there we are, the music. And it is, I have to say, the RAF March, really quite uplifting, isn't it? But I suppose if you're joining a service with the casualty rates the RAF have got, you've got to do something to try and cheer everybody up. And I say that because Bomber Command, and I mentioned this in the interview I did earlier, you know, you think about the numbers, 125,000 people served in Bomber Command in World War II, and of those, 56,000 were killed. Given that probably the last 20,000 of those had not completed their tours when the war ended, basically, if you served in Bomber Command, you had a 50% chance of being killed. So it was pretty grim work from our perspective, and some would argue maybe we went too far. I don't know. I'm going to ask Marion from Finchley what 100 years of the RAF means to her and her family.
Hello, Nigel. I'm delighted to have this opportunity of putting the name of my dear uncle Edric Williams, onto your show.
Yeah.
He was conscripted into the Royal Naval Air Service in 1917, training to be a wireless operator gun layer. I'm reading this from a little book I wrote about my family. He then flew in airships from Folkestone to France, escorting troop ships over and Red Cross ships back, spotting mines floating in the water. He sat in the front of the airship, the pilot sitting behind him.
Gosh.
With a 60 HP Rolls-Royce engine at the back. They flew every day, weather permitting. And, of course, he was very, very young, and he was only 18, and, of course, he was very scared. I mean, I didn't talk at great length with him about it, but clearly it wasn't a fun game, and, as you say, well, the casualties in the Second World War were terrible, but of course in the First World War it was no fun either. Yeah,
I mean, I certainly, at times for RFC and then RAF pilots, sort of life expectancy of about 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Very much backed up by what, you know, Seb Cox said earlier, that a squadron's planes would probably, in a month, have 100% rotation. So, no, absolutely. So, Marion, it means, that's what it means to you. It means these airships across the channel.
Also, Nigel, though, during the Second World War, I was a very little girl, but of course I used to see these planes flying overhead, and naturally they were usually Allied ones, either RAF or American. So, naturally, I grew up with the sound of engines and always thought very, very highly of the Royal Air Force and our heroes.
And Marion, do you have any nagging doubts about Hamburg, Dresden, what was done to German civilians?
None whatsoever.
None whatsoever. OK, Marion, thank you very much indeed for your call. And lots of messages. I'm 80 years old, I lived through the war, and I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the RAF, says Jean from Sheffield. And that's a sentiment I think that many people would share. My grandfather was a gym instructor in the Royal Air Force. He was from Belfast. I recently found this out from researching my history. I feel very proud of him, says Ruth from Solihull. And Ruth, it's very interesting. It's so much easier now to research your family's history. In the old days, you had to go to the Public Records Office in Kew and go through the files. Now with the internet, family searches get bigger and bigger because, hey, they're just easier and easier. Simon is calling from Bolton. Good morning, Simon.
Hi, Nigel. We have spoken before. I'm ex-military, as you know myself, but most to the point is my mother and father served in the Second World War. My dad was with Montgomery in the desert,
Yeah.
and my mum used to drive for Vickers Armstrong, delivering the Hurricane wings and the Spitfire wings to various places. But on occasion, she was seconded to drive Sir Mr. Bomber Harris about
Oh,
to
wow.
different places. But why I like the RAF so much is my father was burnt in the desert in the Second World War. Not badly, but burnt. But his troop was saved by RAF. The RAF pilots came in and fought off the attackers. So they hold great esteem in me, and most of the point is when I've mounted guard at Buckingham Palace, and I've mounted guards with the RAF, and that, it's such a great pleasure, and all credit to any old-timers, because, Nigel, at the end of the day, had it not been for them, we wouldn't be here as we are today.
Well, I think that's
God
right.
bless them.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And Simon, you've highlighted the role that women played. And of course, there were female pilots who were delivering bombers and fighters all over the country. And I do sometimes think perhaps the role of women in World War II gets somewhat underplayed. Thank you, Simon, for your call. Going to go to Mike in York. What does the RAF at 100 mean to you, Mike?
Very much a lot there, Nigel. My dad flew with 115 Squadron from Wychford.
Yep.
They were Lancasters, and he did the last 12 months of the war. He was a bomb aimer.
Yep.
And I have no regrets what happened. I know for a fact that when he came home, he lived in Manchester and seen what the Luftwaffe had done to Manchester and other cities. It's easy now to condemn them, but at the time they didn't know what we know now. But can I just say, your guest spoke eloquently about the RAF and its achievements.
Yep.
But what he failed to mention is one of the things that my dad did was drop food in the Netherlands.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Lancasters did not just drop bombs, they dropped food into the Netherlands where people were starving. They also, of course, in 1948, Mike, the RAF played a massive role in the Berlin airlift, getting food in to Berlin. So, no, you're quite right. The RAF has an important peacetime role as well.
Can I just say one other thing, Nigel?
Quickly, yeah.
Yeah, the other thing is, after the war, the Lancasters brought prisoners home. Prisoners of war were brought home by the RAF.
Yeah. Mike, thank you. Well, in a moment, you're going to listen to an interview I did yesterday with Flight Lieutenant Bob Hughes. I was down in Kent at the Shoreham Aircraft Museum. But for now, you're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. It's 11:30. The Royal Air Force is 100 today, and I'm asking you, what has it meant to you and to your family? You can let me know on 03456 6060 973. And even if you've got no link at all with the RAF, I hope by listening to this hour, you might just learn something you didn't know before, because I have already. Now, yesterday, on the eve of this anniversary, I went down to the Shoreham Aircraft Museum, little village in Kent, just outside Sevenoaks, very close to where I live and very close to Biggin Hill. I was hoping to meet two World War II veterans, but one of them, Tom Neal, Spitfire pilot, had a tooth abscess, which I tell you what, a tooth abscess is horrible, you know, if you're 25, let alone, I think he's 97 or something like that. But there was a World War II veteran on parade, Flight Lieutenant Bob Hughes, DFC AE, and Bob was there, and he's getting on a bit, and he was treated like a mega celebrity, and about an hour people just queued continuously to have their photograph with him, and he was signing a portrait of himself. So by the time I got to him, he was a little bit tired, but still very, very keen to talk about his experiences. And in 1940 he was in Blenheims, and I started by asking him if he thought he was going to get through the war.
I did. I was pretty sure.
Well, you never doubted for one moment
No. There were a rotten lot that we were fighting, you know.
But I mean, the rest of Europe had fallen. Britain was standing alone.
But somebody got to fight and stand up against them. We couldn't let them get away with it.
And you're right, we didn't, and we succeeded. And when you look back, you know, I mean, it's a long time ago, all this. It's 78 years ago, 1940, isn't it?
Yeah.
How does it feel to be, and we've got all these young people around here.
Yeah.
Do you realise that, I mean, the RAF tomorrow is going to be 100 years old,
Yes, I realise that.
but you're nearly as old as the RAF.
I'm 97.
Oh, you're quite young then, really, then.
Yeah, 97.
And what does, having served in the RAF, what does that mean to you now?
Well, I'm pleased that I had the opportunity to do it. Really.
And do you think young people today really understand the sacrifices that your generation had to make?
Different people have got different ideas. Yes, a few of them were quite pleased that we'd done it. Quite a lot of them, I dare say, but there was quite a few that couldn't care less.
No, but that probably applied all through history anyway.
Yeah.
But the what do you think back to 1940? Does it bring back good memories, bad memories, a bit of everything?
Wonderful memories. Wonderful memories.
What people, places?
I had a wife that I've lost since, and she was in the RAF as well, you know.
And as we celebrate this 100th birthday of the Royal Air Force, do you think the Royal Air Force has a great future going on from here?
Oh yes, I do. Yeah.
Well, mind you,
For it.
there aren't so many of them now. It's a bit smaller. It's a
No.
bit more high tech. And but tell us a bit about the Blenheim as an aeroplane, what it did.
A wonderful aircraft. I don't know. You know, I can picture it over and over again that it's lovely to be in it, to fly in it.
And how many people would serve on that plane?
3 or 4 usually.
And tell us,
Quite often it was just the skipper who was saying, "Bob, it's your turn now. Come up and have a go." And that's the thing that pleased me more than anything, that I was allowed to fly the plane. And we did quite several times. If you had a good pilot who relied on you.
but I guess you had to keep your eyes out, didn't you, in 1940? Because there were some people out there who didn't wish you anything but harm.
Yes, I suppose so.
I have to say, you seem in amazing good humour. You're very positive about all the things
Oh, yes.
that happened in the past, and you know, you helped defeat the Nazis.
Yes. I was thrilled that I had the opportunity.
Well, I have to say, I think it's remarkable to talk to somebody who 78 years ago was involved at the time in what probably is the greatest...
97.
You were 97?
Yeah.
Well, I have to say, you don't look 97.
Now I'm going to America now as soon as I can to celebrate several things.
You're going to America?
Yes, soon.
It's quite old to be going to America, isn't it?
I dare say, but I can appreciate probably more than I would have done if I'd have gone younger.
Well, I have to say, I've got before me this really quite magnificent picture of
As a
you.
matter of fact, of all the photographs when I've had a picture taken here and there, this was the only one that looked like anything like that.
I noticed that you're smoking a pipe. That was quite common in those days.
Yes, I like the pipe.
When did you... Can I ask
I
when
don't
you...
care for cigarettes at all, but I do like the pipe.
Can I ask when you gave up smoking?
Oh, I suppose when I was about 30.
Okay, well, it's a wonderful, wonderful picture of you, pipe clenched firmly between teeth, and Flight Lieutenant Bob Hughes, DFC AE. I have to say, it's an absolute pleasure to meet you, and I think it's probably what I want you to do is to wish the Royal Air Force a happy 100th birthday.
I do.
He said after that he'd like to join again. A remarkable, amazing picture of him with his pipe. And hey, in 1940, though he wasn't the pilot, he did fly the Blenheim during the period of the Battle of Britain. He then went on, Bob, and served on 1,000 bomber raids in Lancaster and just lived an extraordinary life. And I've rarely met anybody quite so optimistic about life and still full at 97 of good humour. Come in, Nigel. It's Shoreham Aircraft Museum here, listening into your show and loving it. Don't forget, us, we're waiting with the Spitfire Ale to celebrate the RAF 100. Not today, folks, but it's a lovely idea. So, there aren't many of that generation left. I mean, not much more than a handful of people who were in the air in 1940 still survive. So that opportunity yesterday was one that I grabbed with both hands. I'm going to go to Peter in Hampstead and ask him, what's the RAF meant to you and your family over the last 100 years, Peter?
Well, I think what it's meant to me, I'm from West Hampstead, actually. Don't want to be have the old lovies in Hampstead rubbed off on me.
Right, OK. Peter from West Hampstead, OK.
Absolutely right. I think what a lot of people relate to the RAF through the Red Arrows.
Yeah.
And the girl next door was struck dumb. She didn't speak for 10 minutes when they passed over West Hampstead on the way to the Olympics. And they were stunning. But I have heard a story, just flying past, about 1,200 feet.
They are still a fantastic sight, aren't they?
They are, but I've heard a story, and I'm not sure whether it's true or not, but their aircraft are very elderly and somewhat flaky. And I think it is absolutely preposterous if it's true. And I think that if this is true, then they should be given as a 100th birthday present a complete set of new aircraft.
Yeah. There was talk, Peter, as part of defence cuts of the Red Arrows being phased out, which I think would be dreadful. So these aircraft, to your knowledge, Peter, from West Hampstead, these aircraft are old and need replacing, yeah?
I've heard this story, and the thing is, it's not a complete loss, because these aircraft are perfectly excellent for training purposes. They can be sold, they can be used in the RAF, or they can be sold abroad for advanced training purposes, and get a complete set of new Hawks in as a 100th anniversary.
Right, and you think that... And the Red Arrows are a good advertisement of the Royal Air Force to people in this country and all around the world, and they're amazing flying skills too.
Oh, they're beyond extraordinary. When you bear in mind the fact that they're only 5 or 6 foot apart.
Yes.
And they're flying at 300 miles an hour.
Yeah, when they cross each other, it's almost scary to watch it, isn't it? Peter, the Red Arrows must be saved and modernised at all costs. I thank you very much indeed. Bill says to me, what the RAF and all armed services, past and present, mean to me at 71 is I've gone to bed every night without fear or hunger, for which I'm grateful. There is a plaque at Errol Airfield to commemorate the Russian pilot aces who taught our pilots during the Second World War, says Graham from Errol in Scotland. Happy Easter, Nigel. I remember the Lancaster aircraft flying over during the war in Dorset, where I was born, and watching them fly back, and still remember the sound. We owe our lives to them. Well, I guess that's pretty powerful stuff. My uncle crossed the Irish border at 15, lied about his age, joined the RAF, spent 31 years there. Him and his wife, a member of the WAF, then had 11 children in 6 different countries. Happy birthday to the RAF, says Simon. Simon, I think you've got a family connection to the RAF. I really, really do. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's now 11:46. Well, that's the RAF March, and the RAF is 100 today. Emma in Hertford texts me to say the 97-year-old ex-Royal Air Force serviceman who just called was lovely to listen to. And I got just emotional, so emotional, listening to the two of you talk. Emma, it was filmed too. And if you go to Twitter, at Nigel_Farage, you will see a short film of my visit to the Shoreham Museum and my interview with Flight Lieutenant Bob Hughes. Now, my next caller is called Bill, and he's calling from Orpington. Good morning, Bill.
Good morning, Nigel.
Now, my telephone people tell me that you've got a story to tell us.
It is a good story. I'm 96. I was in the RAF for 5 years during the war.
Right.
And just to start off, this story made the Liverpool newspapers at the time. I'm a Liverpoolian. But I was posted out. I did a session here at a maintenance unit, and I was posted to India, and at a place called Baripur. And the CEO had put a notice on the notice board asking for an artist to decorate the mess, the officers' mess. And when I went, I was told, it was Wing Commander Nicholson, who was the only RAF pilot to win the Victoria Cross. And he was just like Kenneth Moore.
Like Kenneth Moore, right, yes.
A glass of whiskey. And I said, what do you like? He said, you do what you like, sir. for some reason, I did the Arabian Nights round this mess. And the feature was the Caliph of Baghdad on a flying carpet, but a gross figure stoned out of his mind and holding a glass of wine that was spilling. And I just about finished this, and I was told an Air Chief Marshal was coming to look at it. And he came in, flanked by two officers, and he was the dead image of this Caliph. And he didn't say anything, but when he left, the two officers came back in, and one said, he leaned over and said, we would like you to put a moustache and beard on that. What happened? But it was incredible. I froze, but anyway, the story got later. I did 3 murals. By the way, I'm an ex-cartoonist. I did a famous strip in the Daily Mirror.
Okay.
Called The Perishers.
The Perishers, my goodness me. And Bill, you're with us, you're 96, you're clearly with it.
Absolutely.
But there's an awful lot of people who died in their early 20s in the RAF, aren't there?
Absolutely, yeah.
And how do you, when you look back...
I met some of these fellas,
yes,
Britain boys, because some of them were sent out. And they're terrific people. And I'll tell you what, you remind me of them. Because their attitude was, they come over here with their bloody swastikas and crosses.
Spoken like a true cartoonist, Bill. Bill, great call. Thank you very much indeed. The satirist in Bill still alive and kicking at 96. Very, very good. Jackie from Watford makes the point, Lancaster bombers brought back the injured in World War II. So Lancaster's brought back former prisoners of war, they brought back the injured, they dropped food into the Netherlands, and of course in the Berlin airlift in 1948. Not just bombs. Anthony is calling from Jersey in the Channel Islands. Good morning, Anthony.
Good morning. Thank you very much for taking my call.
Not at all.
I'm not from Jersey. I'm from Manchester. I was born before the war. I'm in my 80s now, and I experienced the Blitz as a schoolboy. And I have served as a national serviceman, but I was in the army in Malaya in the early 50s. And then the late 50s, I was accepted as a cabin crew member, which in those days was BOAC, which is British Airways now.
Yep.
And the flight deck, majority of the flight deck were ex-bomber command pilots, and they were the salt of the earth. I've got the utmost respect for them. There was one captain, he was involved in the sinking of the pocket battleship, the Tirpitz. There were Pathfinders, and they were a great bunch to be with. I was very privileged. And on one occasion, one of my passengers was Douglas Bader.
Oh, wow.
And, I've got great memories. And
now, for those, Anthony, for those who don't know Douglas Bader was a young pilot who, performing an aeronautical stunt before the war, lost both his legs, and no one ever thought he would fly again. And he did fly again. He commanded a big wing during the Battle of Britain. He was ultimately shot down over Europe, became a prisoner, and was such a blooming nuisance, he finished up the war in Colditz. So that's who Douglas Bader is, for those that don't know. And Anthony, when you look at those people that you serve with, were they a different type of person, do you think?
Well, they were. There was no edge with them at all. They were like one of the boys, if you know. We're totally different now, of course, and it changed actually. In the 60s and 70s, when they were coming in from the universities and that, they were a different breed. But as I say, I've got great respect for them, and
and Anthony,
we'll never see the like again. That's for sure.
No, you may well be right. And Anthony, just very quickly, do you, having lived through that period, have any qualms about Hamburg, Dresden, the big bombing raids?
None at all. I mean, Manchester. I live right in virtually the centre of man. We got bombed out. We were in the shelters in the streets, which were the street shelters. They were blast-proof, but not bomb-proof.
Yeah.
So I've got no regrets to that.
No qualms.
I tell you, but I do. What does grieve me, Mr. Farage, is the fact that we won the war in 1945, and in 1972. Edward Heath gave our country away without firing a shot.
Yeah, now,
And
Anthony, I'm going to stop you there because it's Easter Sunday. It's Easter Sunday, and I'm honestly, I promise you, it's a Brexit-free zone. But I do completely understand what you're saying. A lot of people said that to me, and not just. And if I was to be a little bit political, that all those people from the Commonwealth and countries all around the world who'd stood by our side, they were pretty upset back in 1972 as well. But I'm trying to be good on this Easter Sunday. Kevin says on Facebook, "Hi Nigel, I'm now off to Martlesham Heath Museum, where Sir Douglas Bader was stationed and flew Hurricanes." Vandra says, "Feel quite nostalgic when I hear the RAF music. Incredible what all those mostly young men did in defence of freedom. My dad flew Lancasters in Bomber Command. My family recently celebrated with a small belated recognition from this government." Well, Bomber Command, as I've said already, very, very controversial, and after the war, even immediately after Dresden, there was a feeling that perhaps we'd gone just too far with the whole thing. I think I'm right in saying about 600,000 German civilians died through those bombing raids in World War II. In fact, many of their cities were literally flattened. And I think if you wonder about the morality of it, well, I spoke, didn't I, earlier to the RAF historian who said, look, don't make any mistake about it. The Germans were still fighting. We were still taking very, very big casualties. What I remember is asking that very question to a guy who'd served on many Lancaster missions, and in fact, I was a junior member of the same golf club, and I talked to him about that, and he said, "Do you know what?" He said, "When we saw the pictures from Belsen, we realised that we had to do whatever we possibly could to win the war, and those pictures, for me, justified what we did." Happy birthday to the RAF at 100, without whom we would not have stayed a free country. Of that, there is no doubt. You've been listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. I'm back tomorrow night at 7. At 3 this afternoon, it's Kevin Maguire. But up next, it's Majid Nawaz.
Thank you, Nigel.